Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine the vast, dry landscape of Central Arabia, a place that feels, seemingly isolated and timeless. Now picture something that feels completely alien to that image. Two early motor vehicles, not roaring across the sand, but being physically hauled one by teams of camels across the desert floor.
Wow.
This was Riyadh in January 1923. It's this amazing moment where the ancient method of transport is literally wrestling with the grudging arrival of the modern machine, kind of a physical manifestation of these deeper tensions, right?
Absolutely. Or you think about the 1990s in Saudi cities. You could see storefronts displaying modern goods, maybe even mannequins, though often headless, as a nod to religious norms.
Right, a compromise.
Exactly. And then maybe just down the street, the religious police might be raiding cafes, enforcing morality rules against things like smoking.
It's this fascinating, often really contradictory blend of tradition and, incredibly rapid change.
Yeah.
Strict control versus surprising adaptation. That seems to define the history we're about to dive into.
And what's truly fascinating here, and what really jumps out in the source material you've shared with us today, is this persistent push and pull, this dynamic tension that shapes the whole narrative right from the very beginnings.
Absolutely. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a stack of your sources and try to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight. And today, our deep dive is based on excerpts from a specific book, Saudi Arabia, by David Commins. This book, it's really the foundation, the map for our exploration of this incredibly complex history.
In Commins, he approaches this history with a very clear, very insightful analytical framework, which he lays out pretty early on in the material provided.
Okay.
His central argument, essentially, is that Saudi rulers throughout their various incarnations, state formations, have consistently faced and overcome challenges, challenges related to scarcity of legitimacy, sometimes funds, sometimes military power.
Right.
And they overcame these by leveraging different external resources.
So not relying purely on internal strength or, say, popular will, but actively drawing on things from the outside. Is that the idea?
Precisely. And the source makes a really compelling case for how the nature of these external resources has evolved dramatically over time.
Okay, how so?
Well, in the very earliest period, back in the 1740s, the key external resource was Mohammed ibn Abdul Wahhab's religious purification mission. This was a powerful symbolic resource, something unique to their movement at that time.
Right, ideological power.
Exactly. And then fiscally, needs were met through, plunder and tribute gained from jihad, a fiscal resource directly tied to military conquest.
Okay.
But as the state developed, especially in the 20th century, these external resources became much more diverse, more material. You see foreign Arab advisors bringing expertise, funds and arms coming from Britain, then later, of course, immense oil revenue from an American company, Aramco.
Right, the big one.
Strategic protection from the U.S. government, leveraging transnational religious influence through foreign Muslims who came to the kingdom, and eventually a huge expatriate labor force.
It's like a pattern of external dependency, almost, but one they've strategically used to build and maintain power.
Exactly. And Commins' core idea, based on the source, is that this very process, this tapping into external resources, fundamentally reshaped the internal dynamics of the kingdom. It led to new challenges, new contradictions, new transformations that then needed to be managed in turn. It's a cycle.
That lens makes a lot of sense as we look at the history laid out here. So our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack these key insights from these sources using Commins' framework. We'll focus on the specific dates, the events, people, quotes, and the main points covered in the text you provided, just to understand this complex story of Saudi Arabia's formation and how it's been, continuously transformed.
Right. And based on these excerpts, we're going to cover a really sweeping timeline. We'll start with the origins of the first Saudi state in the 1740s, look at its early challenges, then the periods of decline and collapse, leading to the revival under Abd al-Aziz in the early 20th century. We'll need to explore that complex, shifting relationship with external powers. The Ottomans, the British, and later the U.S.
Of course.
A major chunk will obviously cover the immense impact of oil wealth and the incredibly rapid social and economic changes it brought. We'll examine those persistent tensions between religious traditionalism and the forces of modernization, globalization, and how new forms of political and religious activism emerged from that.
And then bringing it more up to date.
Yeah, finally, we'll touch on recent transformations, things like Vision 2030 and how the relationship between the state and the religious establishment seems to be changing yet again.
It's definitely clear this is a history of navigating, well, competing forces.
Yeah.
And the core takeaway from Commins' perspective, repeated throughout this source material, is this consistent reliance on external resources and that enduring tension, between the foundational principles, sectarian purity, patrimonial rule, and these powerful, often disruptive forces of modernization, globalization.
It really is. It's a history that shows continuous adaptation, definitely, but also these deep contradictions that seem baked into the system right from the start.
And this raises a really important, almost paradoxical question that the source kind of implicitly poses, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
How does a state founded on a mission of, strict religious purity and relative isolation in the desert heartland become so fundamentally intertwined with global capitalism, so dependent on external powers for security and prosperity, and then eventually even embrace significant social openings? It feels like a central puzzle running through this whole history.
That's a perfect way to frame it. It's the central question, really.
Okay, well, that's the perfect starting point then. Let's dive into those early origins of the first Saudi state, starting back in the 1740s, and try to understand the world they actually emerged from.
Right. So to understand the beginnings, you really have to look at the setting. Najd, the central plateau of the Arabian Peninsula. The source describes its geography pretty clearly, divided prominently by this long, boomerang-shaped escarpment called the Tuwaik Ridge.
Okay.
To the west of it is Upper Najd, characterized by thin, stony soil, scarce water primarily suitable for grazing camels and sheep. To the east is Lower Najd. This environment, it contrasts sharply with the Hassa region, over along the Persian Gulf Coast.
How so?
Well, Hassa is described as much more fertile. It has crucial ports, making it inherently more outward-facing, more connected to maritime trade and the wider world compared to the interior.
And before the Saudi movement took hold, the political situation in Najd itself was, well, pretty chaotic, wasn't it?
Extremely. Fragmented and unstable are the words the source uses. It paints a picture of constantly shifting, very short-term alliances between opportunistic Bedouin tribes and the emirs, the rulers of the small oasis towns.
It's a constant flux.
Exactly. And as a vivid illustration of just how unstable it was, the chronicles of the time, cited in the source, mention no fewer than 11 distinct military conflicts just in the decades immediately preceding the 1740s.
11, wow.
Yeah, constant skirmishes, raids, battles between different factions, different settlements. It was really a landscape of perpetual low-level conflict.
But amidst all that political fragmentation, was there some kind of shared cultural element, something that tied people together?
Yes, actually a crucial one, Nabati poetry. This was a popular vernacular verse tradition. It celebrated values like valor, generosity, but also captured aspects of everyday life. The source mentions a farmer poet named Humaydan al-Shuwair, whose life spanned the late 17th and early 18th centuries. His language was simple. It spoke directly to the experiences of working the land. The source even quotes him writing about his beloved palm trees at the well's edge. It highlights that there was this common literary tradition existing alongside all the political divisions.
And into this landscape, this mix of conflict and shared culture, came Mohammed ibn Abd al-Wahhab in the 1740s, bringing a completely different kind of force.
Exactly. He returned from his religious studies, probably in the late 1730s, and settled back in his hometown of Haramila, where his father held the position of chief religious judge.
Okay.
And the source specifically notes, interestingly, that he waited until after his father's death in 1741 before he began openly denouncing practices he viewed as deviations from pure Islamic monotheism, particularly the popular cult of saints venerating tombs and things like that.
Right.
His mission was fundamentally a call to revive Islam in what he believed was its original unadulterated form.
And this message, it found traction. It resonated in specific places.
It did. It found receptive audiences in several important towns like Uyayna, Riyadh, Diriyah, and Manfuha. And this is where, Commins' framework becomes immediately relevant.
How so?
The source argues that this religious message became that absolutely vital symbolic resource. It wasn't just about belief. It provided a common platform, a shared ideological foundation that gave the eventual Saudi expansion a unique edge over their rivals whose allegiances were based purely on shifting clan loyalties or temporary political deals.
So it offered something more binding.
Yes, the religious mission introduced this stark choice that essentially divided Najd. To be or not to be a believer, as the source puts it, framing it in the terms of the Wahhabi doctrine. It transcended clan.
And this symbolic resource, this religious imperative, it fueled that famous alliance, didn't it? Between Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab and Mohammed bin Saud in Diriyah.
That's the pivotal moment.
And their early state, it must have faced an immediate challenge.
Yeah.
How do you actually generate revenue in such an arid environment?
Yeah, that was a huge problem. Given the limited potential for agricultural surplus in most of Najd, traditional revenue sources were scarce. The source mentions an early, very significant step. Sheikh Mohammed, that's Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, persuaded Mohammed ibn Saud to stop collecting what they termed illegal taxes not sanctioned by their interpretation of Islamic law.
Okay, so they cut off one source. What replaced it?
They needed a replacement, exactly. The proposed new source of revenue was essentially plunder and punitive indemnities gained from military expeditions framed as jihad, as holy war against those who didn't accept their doctrine.
Right.
The chronicles of the time, cited in the source, they detail the types of booty seized: livestock, weapons, personal belongings, plus these financial penalties imposed on towns that resisted their authority.
And what about zakat, the Islamic religious tax?
The zakat collection is mentioned, yes, but the source notes that specific details about how much revenue came from zakat are actually lacking in those very early records. Plunder seems to have been more prominent, or at least better documented initially.
And where did this revenue from plunder or zakat actually go?
Early expenditures, according to the source, were primarily distributed among the Saud clan itself, their allied emirs, and importantly used for providing food for the poor, which aligned with the established Quranic categories for charity and social welfare.
So while the Diriyah Emirate was dramatically changing the political and religious map of Najd, the source suggests its impact on day-to-day society and the economy in these early decades was maybe less profound, less transformative initially.
That seems to be the implication, yes. Take the Bedouin tribes, for example. Their allegiance, which was crucial for military strength, was conditional. It required them to adhere to correct worship according to Wahhabi standards, pay zakat, follow the basic Islamic laws interpreted by the movement, and crucially, cease their traditional raiding and toll collection on travelers.
Which must have been a huge change for them.
A massive change to their traditional economy and way of life, and if they renounced this allegiance, they faced punitive attacks from the Diriyah forces. So this conditional loyalty really highlights the fragile nature of early state control over these nomadic populations.
The source also touches briefly on potential unintended effects of Wahhabi teachings, specifically on women. What does it say there?
It suggests a complex impact. On one hand, traditional religious practices often associated with women, things like visiting local shrines, using amulets for healing, these were abolished as forms of polytheism or innovation.
Right.
Believers were strongly encouraged, maybe even required, to attend the mosque. And while women could attend Friday prayer separated at the back, their opportunities for collective religious observance outside the strictly defined male-dominated space of the mosque became significantly limited once these other forms of worship and traditional customs were banished.
Okay, now the expansion of this first Saudi state wasn't just a smooth, continuous process, was it? There were significant setbacks. I remember reading about the brief occupation of Mecca.
That's right. In April 1803, the Saudi forces did manage to occupy Mecca. They expelled the ruling Sharif and imposed their puritanical religious regime, making prayer compulsory, raising domes over tombs and other structures they deemed idolatrous, banning tobacco.
But they didn't hold it for long.
No, their hold was tenuous. They were forced to retreat fairly quickly in the face of an Ottoman relief force sent from Egypt, and any plans they had to retake control were then seriously disrupted by the assassination of the Saudi emir Abd al-Aziz in November 1803.
Do we know who was behind that?
The source notes there was speculation at the time, maybe a Shiite retaliating for an earlier Saudi massacre in the holy city of Karbala, or possibly a Kurdish agent linked to the Ottomans who saw the Saudis as a growing threat. It's not definitively stated.
Okay, so moving forward into the 19th century, we see the first Saudi state actually collapse, right? And a period of renewed fragmentation begins, but with a new power center emerging in the north.
Yes, this was indeed a period of serious decline for Saudi power and a resurgence of that fragmented rule we talked about earlier. The new major player was the Rashidi Emirate, based in Haley in northern Najd.
And what was the basis of their strength? How did they rise?
The source explains their strength came from two key factors. First, strong local support from the powerful Shamar tribal sheikhs in their home region. And second, crucially, they cultivated friendly ties with the Ottoman authorities in Istanbul.
Interesting. So they worked with the Ottomans, unlike the early Saudis.
Generally, yes. Their methods for securing allegiance within Najd also differed. They relied more on material means, things like paying subsidies to tribes, holding large public feasts to demonstrate generosity. And to maintain those vital Ottoman ties, they sent gifts, especially prized Arabian horses, and paid tribute to Ottoman pashas in places like Damascus and Medina.
And they became quite influential, almost kingmakers, in the ongoing Saudi internal conflicts.
Exactly. By 1887, the Rashidi leader, Mohammed ibn Rashid, had expanded his influence significantly and was able to decisively intervene in the internal Saudi power struggles happening further south. He defeated the sons of the Saudi leader Saud and actually held Abdullah ibn Saud, one of the main contenders, as a guest in Hell, which was effectively a form of political hostage-taking.
Right.
After Abdullah's death, his brother, Abd al-Rahman, who was the father of the later founder of modern Saudi Arabia, attempted to reclaim Saudi influence through alliances, but this led to a final, devastating confrontation.
The Battle of Mulaida.
Yes, that was in January 1891. Mohammed ibn Rashid mobilized his forces and his allies and inflicted a truly catastrophic defeat on Abd al-Rahman and his coalition near Buraida in the Qasim region.
And the consequences were severe for the Sauds.
Absolutely. This defeat forced Abd al-Rahman and his entire family, including his young son Abdulaziz, into exile. They mostly found refuge in Kuwait, hosted by its ruler. For a time, Saudi power in Najd effectively vanished once again. The Rashidis were dominant.
It really seems like this period, the shifting power, the conflict, these Bedouin oasis dynamics, was deeply reflected in the culture, particularly in that Nabati poetry you mentioned earlier.
It absolutely was. The source explicitly connects these political patterns to the cultural ones, especially that strong warrior ethos and the tradition of, boastful Nabati verse that could be used to rally, support, or taunt enemies.
Like propaganda almost.
In a way, yes. A prime example given is Ubayd al-Rashid. He was the brother of the Rashidi emir and renowned as both a fierce warrior and a skilled poet. The source quotes from an ode he wrote celebrating the Shamar tribe's triumph over the region of Qasim in 1841. He recounts slaying 90 of the enemy and glorifies the valor and, importantly, the divine favor enjoyed by his tribe.
That specific detail, 90 of the enemy, it gives a real sense of the boastful, martial nature of this poetry. And his response to retaliation is quite evocative too, isn't it?
It is. When the emir of Unaiza, one of the Qasim towns, retaliated against the Rashidis, Ubayd responded with what the source describes as a kind of verbal shrug, combined with barbed taunts insulting his foe's manliness.
Ah, classic.
Right. He boasts about attacking the enemy's stronghold directly, not just raiding peripheral areas, and talks about drenching swords in blood. It's a really vivid cultural artifact reflecting the power struggles of the time, where poetry was genuinely a tool of war and diplomacy.
And the source points to a specific figure, Abdallah Aloni, who lived from about 1870 to 1923, as the last significant poet to really use Nabati verse in this particular way, weaponizing it directly for political ends.
Yes. Ioni's career, as the source details it, perfectly mirrored the turbulence of that whole era. He grew up under a patron allied with the Sauds against the Rashidis, and then went into exile himself after that defeat at Mulaida in 1891. A decade later, he actually used his poetry to incite Abd al-Rahman, the exiled Saudi leader, to try and expel the Rashidis from Riyadh. And after Abdulaziz did capture Riyadh in 1902, Oni composed this incredibly powerful, rousing poem known as Al-Khaluj.
What was its purpose?
It was aimed at rallying Qasimi traders and workers who were scattered across the region in Iraq, Kuwait, Syria. He used this potent metaphor of Qasim, their homeland, as a mother camel suffering mistreatment, calling on the men, her sons, to fight for her honor against the Rashidi occupiers.
So his poetry had a very real, tangible impact on events. You could see it mobilizing people.
It definitely did. It really underscores the power of this cultural form within that specific political context, but Oni also represents the twilight of that entire era.
How so?
Well, after initially opposing Abdulaziz and even supporting the Rashidis when Hal finally fell, Abdulaziz had him brought to Riyadh. Suspecting him of plotting further intrigue, Abdulaziz eventually imprisoned him in Hufuf down in Hassa. Oni died there of tuberculosis shortly after his release in 1923. And the source mentions this prophetic saying from another poet, predicting that Oni's own poetry would eventually bring about his death. It's quite a poignant symbol, really, of the end of that epoch, where the warrior poet was so deeply integrated into the political and military struggles of Najd.
Which leads us perfectly into the second Saudi revival, the one spearheaded by the young Abdulaziz himself.
Exactly. January 15th, 1902. That's the key date. Abdelaziz returns from exile in Kuwait with just a small band of loyal fighters, maybe 40 or 60 men.
Right, the famous raid.
The famous raid. They launched a surprise attack on Riyadh, scaling the walls, killing the Rashidi governor, and successfully regaining the ancestral seat of the Saudi emirate. A few months later, his father, Abdullah Rahman, formally named him the new leader.
And he started consolidating power.
Yes, with support from the oasis towns along the Tuwaiq Ridge, places that had resented Rashidi rule, they quickly regained control over the nearby regions of Sudair and Washim.
And Abdelaziz's strategy for expansion and state building, as the source highlights it, seems to have combined elements of the first state's methods, but also incorporated these new external resources you talked about.
Absolutely. The source points to several key factors in his success against his various Arabian rivals. First, yes, he mobilized Bedouin tribesmen using a revived sectarian framework, particularly through the Ikhwan, the Brethren movement, who were zealous converts to the Wahhabi cause.
Okay, the religious element again.
Definitely. But second, he strategically leveraged the common Gulf Emirate strategy of allying with Great Britain, which became a crucial external patron providing vital funds and arms. And third, he imported foreign Arab expertise, advisors from places like Syria and Egypt, to help administer his growing domains.
But this combined approach, it must have created an immediate and pretty fundamental contradiction, right?
A significant one, yes. The source notes the inherent difficulty, the tension, in transitioning from military expansion based on sectarian mobilization, which naturally viewed infidels like the British, and idolatrous Arabs like those in the Hijaz, with deep suspicion to the political consolidation phase that required allying with those infidel Christians and integrating territories populated by those idolatrous Arabs.
Yeah, that seems like a tricky balancing act.
It was a core contradiction baked into Abdelaziz's state-building project from the start.
One of his major early territorial gains, which brought this into focus, was the annexation of Hassa, the eastern oasis region.
That took place in 1913. The source describes the varied reactions among Hassa's merchants down there. Some who had actually favored a return to Ottoman rule were apparently executed. Others, though, welcomed Abdelaziz, hoping he'd be more effective than the often weak Ottoman administration at suppressing disruptive Bedouin raids that harmed trade.
And the timing of this annexation was diplomatically interesting, wasn't it?
Very. It happened just 2 days before a draft treaty between Istanbul and London was signed on May 6, 1913. And that treaty actually recognized Hassa as Ottoman territory. So Abdelaziz moved just in time, or perhaps just too late, depending on your perspective.
How did he navigate that diplomatic complexity? That must have been tricky.
He showed incredible pragmatism. Publicly, he immediately proclaimed loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul and offered to serve as their governor, their wali, in Hassa.
Okay.
But at the same time, he was quietly opening channels, making overtures to British officials in the Gulf. Since London wasn't yet willing to risk alienating Istanbul completely just for his sake, Abdelaziz secured his position for the moment by making a formal agreement with Istanbul in May 1914.
What did that agreement entail?
It recognized him as the hereditary Ottoman governor of Najd, which now included Hassa, allowed him to fly the Ottoman flag, and obligated him to use Ottoman mail and customs systems. Essentially, it bought him time and a veneer of legitimacy while he continued to cultivate British support behind the scenes.
Very shrewd. Now, another massive transformation under Abd-al-Aziz, something the source calls the end of an epoch, was the integration, or maybe you could say the subjugation, of the Bedouin tribes, especially the Ikhwan.
Yes. The defeat of the Ikhwan rebels in 1929 at the Battle of Sabila was the decisive moment. Although the Ikhwan claimed religious fidelity to Abd al-Aziz, they fundamentally rejected central state authority and the modern concept of fixed international borders. They wanted to continue their jihad against neighboring territories like Iraq and Transjordan.
Right, they wouldn't stop raiding.
Exactly. Their suppression by Abd al-Aziz, using forces now equipped with British arms and even vehicles, effectively ended that independent Bedouin power. They could no longer collect tribute from settled populations, they lost much of their autonomy, they faced restrictions on their traditional patterns of migration, and their raiding practices were definitively abolished by the centralizing state.
This wasn't unique to Saudi Arabia at the time, though, was it? This taming of the Bedouin.
No, not at all. The source frames this clearly as part of a larger regional process. It's the story of the modern international state system, with its defined borders and central control, disrupting traditional pastoral nomadism right across the Middle East. You see similar processes happening in Iran, Transjordan, Iraq around the same time.
And what happened to the Bedouin then?
Well, populations that were once independent actors were increasingly marginalized. They were relegated to activities like cross-border smuggling or settled, sometimes reluctantly, into government-sponsored agricultural schemes or forced to trade their nomadic independence for access to basic state services and a measure of stability.
And the source links this back, interestingly, to that cultural element we discussed, the demise of the boastful Najdi warrior poet.
It does. It feels like a fitting symbolic end. The source quotes a saying that really captures the old mindset. It is of no real consequence to lead an army. What is of real consequence is to be a poet like me. Right. But the political and military changes under Abd al-Aziz meant there was simply no longer a place for that kind of poet, whose verse was so integral to rallying tribal forces and celebrating martial prowess in that decentralized, constantly shifting world.
And Abdullah Aloni, the last of them.
Exactly. Abdullah Aloni, the last major figure in that tradition, died in 1923, just as the traditional Bedouin way of life was entering its terminal phase. His death, which another poet had apparently predicted would be caused by his own powerful verse, symbolically marks the end of that specific intertwined political and cultural order.
Okay, turning now to the early governance under Abd al-Aziz. Despite the state's rapid expansion, the source describes a persistence of very traditional patrimonial rule.
This is a key point Commins makes. Power remained highly centralized and deeply personal. There was very little specialization of government offices in the modern bureaucratic sense.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, the source provides a really striking one from Riyadh around 1930. It mentions there were supposedly 17 departments of government, but these weren't ministries or bureaus as we'd think of them. They were literally just rooms or wings within the royal palace complex, each dedicated to a specific function, like housing the royal camels, maintaining the few cars they had, operating the radio transmitter, providing hospitality to guests, or running a small clinic.
It sounds incredibly informal and completely centered around the person of the ruler.
It really was. Abd al-Aziz relied heavily on just one key individual, Abdallah Suleiman, who was a former trader from Unaiza, to handle almost everything related to the treasury and state finances.
Just one guy.
Pretty much as chief financial officer, minister of everything else. Suleiman reported only to Abd al-Aziz, and apparently kept sensitive state financial records locked away in wooden chests. And these chests were transported by camels whenever the king and his court traveled.
Records and chests on camels. That image really emphasizes the ad hoc, personal nature of governance at that time.
It absolutely does. It was government on the move, centered entirely on the king's person and his immediate retinue.
And within this system, the public performance of generosity by the ruler was clearly essential, wasn't it? Part of the deal.
Oh, fundamental. The source quotes Ibn Shihab, who was Abd al-Aziz's chief steward. Every king in the world is supported by his people, but the people of Najd are supported by their king.
That says it all.
It really encapsulates that expectation of royal patronage. The Syrian-American writer Ayman al-Rihani observed this system firsthand during his visit in 1922-23. He noted the palace routinely provided 2 meals a day for about 500 people, retainers, visitors, the poor, and there were biannual distributions of cloaks and other goods.
And Ibn Shihab kept track of all this.
Meticulously. He kept detailed lists of visitors, their tribal or town affiliations, their reason for visiting. Abd al-Aziz would use these lists to determine the appropriate allocations of goods and money. Rihani even recorded watching Ibn Shihab dictating instructions like, write in the book, Ahmad ibn Jaber of Tharmada, 250 rupees. This wasn't just random charity, it was a systematic form of patronage designed to reinforce loyalty and dependence on the ruler.
In this whole system of generosity, it obviously depended on revenue. How did that evolve, especially after the annexation of the Hijaz?
Well, initially, as we said, revenue came primarily from war booty and the religious tax, zakat, on crops and livestock. The source provides some rough figures, maybe around 100,000 pounds sterling annually before the annexation of Hassa.
Okay.
After taking Hassa in 1913, customs duties from the port of Qatif alone were bringing in about 72,000 pounds per year by 1920. Plus, there were those regular British subsidies, which amounted to 60,000 pounds a year between 1917 and 1924. So, on the eve of the campaign to conquer the Hijaz, total annual revenue was estimated at around 210,000 pounds.
But controlling Jeddah and the holy cities, Mecca and Medina, that provided a massive increase, didn't it? A totally new scale of fiscal resource.
A huge jump, yes. Access to the Red Sea trade routes through the port of Jeddah, plus the pilgrim tolls collected from the Hajj traffic to Mecca and Medina, pushed annual revenue up dramatically. The source estimates it reached about 1.5 million.
Wow, quite a difference.
A massive difference. However, this new reliance on pilgrim fees and trade customs also made the state vulnerable to external economic shocks in a way it hadn't been before.
Like the Great Depression.
Exactly. The Great Depression caused a steep decline in international travel, including pilgrim traffic. The number of Hajj pilgrims plummeted from around 132,000 in 1927 to under 30,000 in 1932. Jeddah customs revenue also dropped significantly. This created major fiscal pressure on Abdelaziz's government just as he was trying to consolidate his rule.
Now, the religious establishment, the al-Sheikh family, descendants of Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, they also had to adapt to this expanding state and its increasing interactions with the outside world, didn't they?
They did. Figures like Abdullah ibn Abil al-Latif, who died in 1920, and Abdallah ibn Hassan, who lived until 1958, they maintained a form of patrimonial religious authority, advising the ruler, serving as chief judges. But crucially, the source points out that this generation of senior clerics quietly accepted many of Abdelaziz's necessary political and practical compromises on strict Wahhabi principles.
Such as accepting Western technology that they initially viewed with deep suspicion. Things like the telegraph.
Exactly. They initially opposed many Western inventions, fearing they would bring corrupting influences, but eventually they often relented when the practical benefits became undeniable. The telegraph, for instance, was accepted after it proved invaluable for quickly transmitting orders and news, which helped Abd-al-Aziz quell revolts in the newly annexed regions of Hijaz and Asir in the early 1930s.
Pragmatism won out.
It seems so. They also had to bow to Abd-al-Aziz's broader strategy of leveraging foreign Muslim expertise and establishing diplomatic relations with infidel governments like Britain. These were compromises driven by political necessity, particularly the need to gain consent and govern effectively in regions like the Hijaz, where strict Wahhabi doctrine was not the local norm and imposition would cause friction.
And this pragmatic approach, it led to tension, didn't it? Particularly in the crucial area of education, especially after the annexation of the Hijaz.
Yes, the source highlights this as a key point of conflict between the Wahhabi mission's impulse for ideological purity and the modernist currents coming in, especially from the Hijaz. When Abd-al-Aziz created the Directorate of Education in 1926, he significantly bypassed the senior Wahhabi clerics and put Hijazi and foreign Arab advisors, people with more modern educational backgrounds, in charge.
That must have ruffled some feathers.
Oh, definitely. It essentially created a duality in the emerging state education system. The Wahhabi clerics vehemently opposed the inclusion of subjects like foreign languages and modern science in the curriculum, viewing them as conduits for infidel ideas and Western corruption.
But Abdelaziz sided with the modernizers on this.
Ultimately, yes. He overruled the objections raised by the leaders of the religious mission. The source mentions Hafiz Wahba, the Egyptian who headed the Directorate of Education. He made pragmatic arguments pointing out that even the Prophet's companions spoke other languages, and arguing that it was better for Saudis to learn foreign languages themselves than to remain entirely dependent on foreigners for translation and interaction with the outside world. Abd-al-Aziz approved Wahba's plan, clearly prioritizing the perceived practical needs of the state over the clerics' insistence on ideological purity in the classroom.
And that striking image we started with, the motor vehicles arriving in Riyadh, hauled by camels, that fits right into this period of tentative, sometimes awkward modernization.
Yes. The source calls their arrival in January 1923 the most significant omen of a different future. Initially, perhaps, they were partly a curiosity and a source of leisure for the elite. The source describes Abd-al-Aziz enjoying desert excursions and races in cars driven by an Indian chauffeur, followed by his traditional court entourage on horseback.
Quite a picture.
Isn't it? But the source emphasizes the practical utility that quickly cemented their place. Motor vehicles proved crucial for rapidly moving troops and supplies to suppress the rebellious Ikhwan Brethren. Their military value in projecting state power across vast distances was undeniable.
So even early technology became another tool, another kind of external resource that was leveraged for internal consolidation and control.
Exactly. It fits the pattern. The source neatly summarizes Abd-al-Aziz's transformation up to this point. He began by mobilizing a sectarian religious mission for conquest, then pivoted to allying with infidel Britain to conquer and consolidate power over the Bedouin tribes in the name of stability. By the early 1930s, facing fiscal pressure from the Great Depression and the effective end of that traditional Bedouin economy based on tribute and raiding, the big question became, What new resources would replace conquest, and how would the Bedouin and the broader population survive in this new order?
Right.
The transformations in political power and religious culture were clearly underway, but as the source notes, they didn't yet have sturdy material foundations. The state was still quite fragile financially.
And that, of course, is where oil arrives, the ultimate game-changing external resource.
Absolutely. The discovery of commercial quantities of oil in the late 1930s and the arrival and expansion of Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company, after World War II marked a fundamental revolutionary shift.
And how did Aramco operate initially? What impact did it have on labor?
Well, the source highlights how Aramco, drawing partly on established labor practices from the mining industries back in the U.S. and South America, implemented a labor system that was noticeably stratified along ethnic and racial lines.
How so?
Different jobs, different pay scales, different housing conditions were often allocated based on nationality or origin. Americans at the top, then Europeans, then various Arab nationalities, then Saudis, Indians, Pakistanis, etc. further down. This racist labor regime, as the source describes it, inevitably created significant grievances among the workforce.
And those grievances, they actually sparked the first instance of modern political mobilization in Saudi Arabia's history.
That's what the source argues, yes. The combination of harsh working conditions, the mingling of different nationalities in the oil camps, including workers who had prior experience with labor organizing in their home countries, created the environment for collective action.
When did this start?
The source mentions early protests specifically by Indian workers in February-March 1943 and again in October 1944. Aramco's initial response, interestingly, was often just to replace the protesting group. First, they brought in Italian workers from Eritrea to replace the Indians.
Right.
Then later, they replaced some Italians with workers recruited from Aden and Khartoum, seemingly operating under the assumption that the problem was specific troublemakers rather than the underlying conditions themselves.
But the protest didn't stop there, did they? Even the European workers got involved.
Right. In 1953, Italian workers actually protested against being housed in a mixed camp alongside Palestinians, Pakistanis, and Indians, which itself shows the pervasiveness of that ethnic hierarchy. By this time, Aramco was also actively recruiting more foreign Arabs, particularly Palestinians, partly at the encouragement of King Abd al-Aziz after the 1948 Palestine War. The source mentioned that by the end of 1950, around 800 Palestinians were working for the company.
And all of this tension and organizing eventually culminated in the really significant strike of 1953.
Yes. According to the source, around 150 workers, a mix of Saudis, foreign Arabs, and others, managed to organize and draft a petition outlining their various grievances regarding wages, conditions, and discrimination.
And the timing was strategic.
The source points out the timing was crucial. The Saudi government happened to be in the process of negotiating a revision of Aramco's original concession agreement, which led the workers to believe, perhaps optimistically, that Riyadh might actually back their demands against the company. They submitted a mass petition directly to Crown Prince Saud, seeking official approval to form a recognized workers' committee.
But the reaction from the government wasn't exactly one of support, was it?
No. Ministry of Finance officials were sent down to Dhahran in early October 1953, and they were reportedly quite startled, even alarmed, by the sight of this grassroots activism emerging among the workforce. On October 15th, the authorities responded not with negotiation, but by arresting the key organizers of the petition drive.
And that triggered wider action.
It did. It triggered immediate protests. The very next day, demonstrations took place at the Hofuf police station, outside the American consulate, and near the Dhahran Air Base.
And the strike itself, how widespread was it?
It began formally on October 17th and lasted for 10 days. It was substantial, involving some 13,000 workers, according to the source's figures. The government response was firm. Around 1,000 Saudi workers were arrested during the course of the strike.
So repression ended it.
Ultimately, yes, state repression ended the strike action. However, Aramco was compelled to make some concessions afterwards. They agreed to raise wages, cover certain expenses like work uniforms, and, significantly, admit the children of Saudi workers to the previously exclusive company-run schools.
The source seems to view this whole event through the lens of broader patterns of modern political contention, doesn't it?
Yes, it fits a pattern seen elsewhere in industrializing or colonial contexts. You have an aggrieved party, the workers. You have a target, which is both the company and implicitly the state that permits its operations. And you have the act of pressing the state to intervene, either to mediate or, in this case, primarily to suppress. This triangle of workers, company, and state, along with the multinational character of the workforce, became defining features of labor relations in the Gulf oil zones for decades.
But despite the emergence of these modern forms of political action like strikes, the core structure of governance itself seemed to lag behind. It remained quite traditional.
Yes, the source reiterates that ad hoc, patrimonial nature of the administration continued well into the oil era. The example of Abdullah Suleiman, the king's chief financier, continues to illustrate this point. His responsibilities remained incredibly varied and ill-defined by modern standards. At different times, he might be acting as foreign affairs deputy, arranging transport for foreign dignitaries, allocating zakat funds, or dispatching health workers to deal with an outbreak somewhere. King Abdulaziz continued to rely on him as a versatile, indispensable troubleshooter, which highlights the ongoing lack of specialized, independent bureaucratic institutions that you'd expect in a modern state.
Okay. Beyond labor and administration, cultural and intellectual influences from outside also continued to shape the society, didn't they? Especially in the Hijaz.
Definitely. Foreign Arabs, particularly those who came to work or settle in the kingdom, and the lingering influence of late Ottoman institutions and personnel in the Hijaz region served as key conduits for modernist literary and intellectual currents. These were often emanating from the major Arab intellectual centers like Cairo and Damascus, and even from the Syrian-American diaspora writers in the Americas.
So Hijaz was kind of a window to the wider Arab world.
It seems so. The source mentions a newspaper called Al-Qibla, which had been the official mouthpiece during the Sharifian period before the Saudi conquest. It apparently featured poems and essays that celebrated technical progress, criticized aspects of tradition, and experimented with new forms of writing. And figures like Muhammad Hassan Awad are highlighted as pioneers in Hijazi literary modernism, writing free verse, using mythic figures who then mentored younger poets featured in publications after the Saudi annexation.
And alongside these literary currents, transnational religious and political ideologies were also finding fertile ground.
Yes, organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded by Hassan al-Banna in Egypt back in 1928, and another Egyptian group, the Helpers of the Prophetic Tradition, Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyah, founded by Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqi in 1926, became increasingly influential.
And what was their appeal or function in the Saudi context?
Well, these groups, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, had pretty comprehensive programs encompassing welfare activities, education, political ideology, all aimed at combating what they saw as harmful Western intellectual currents, things like Darwinism, Marxism, Freudianism.
So they offered a kind of alternative modernity, an Islamic one.
You could see it that way.
Yeah.
And the source notes they provided a useful ground and intellectual framework for Wahhabi proselytizing efforts abroad. Importantly, members of these groups, particularly Egyptians and Syrians fleeing secular regimes at home, often came to Saudi Arabia and staffed some of the transnational religious institutions that the Saudis began to set up in Mecca, like the Muslim World League.
So they became another kind of external resource personnel and ideology.
Exactly. Figures like Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqi, the Egyptian writer, publicly praised the Saudis for bringing order to the Hijaz and lauded the Wahhabi mission for supposedly spreading literacy. On the Saudi side, you had writers like Abdullah al-Qasimi, who attempted to frame the whole Saudi enterprise as a kind of nationalist saga, blending national rebirth with the religious mission. Although the source points out he significantly misrepresented the original Wahhabi mission by claiming it was always open to modern inventions, which wasn't really the case initially.
Right. Now, by the 1960s, the influx of oil wealth was really accelerating, leading to a deliberate shift towards state-led development projects, which was pretty common across the Middle East at that time.
Yes, this state-led development model in Saudi Arabia, while fueled by oil, also had roots in those older dynamics we discussed. The traditional Najdi expectation of royal generosity, the long-standing dependence on state patronage in the Hijaz, and the administrative advantages the state gained from managing the Hajj pilgrimage.
And what was the focus of these early development projects?
The focus was primarily on increasing production and expanding public services, building roads, ports, hospitals, schools. King Saud, after he ascended the throne following Abdulaziz's death in 1953, explicitly stated aspirations to boost agriculture through large-scale irrigation projects and dams, and to better integrate rural and urban areas through modern communication networks.
This must have required establishing more formal government institutions and legal frameworks than existed before.
It did. New agencies were created, like the Central Planning Organization in 1965 and Petromin in 1962, which was set up to negotiate oil concessions independently of Aramco and develop downstream industries. New legal frameworks were also introduced covering areas like banking, the Banking Control Law of 1966, land ownership and distribution, the Land Apportionment Act of 1968, and labor relations, the Labor Law of 1969, the labor law being partly a response designed to manage and prevent the kind of unrest seen in 1953.
And who led these projects? Saudis.
It was often a mix. These large development projects were frequently led by foreign experts, alongside a growing cadre of Saudis who had been educated in Western universities, bringing back technical skills.
And the impact of all this oil wealth and state-led development on urbanization and migration patterns must have been profound.
Absolutely dramatic. The source highlights a major demographic shift. That ratio of rural to urban population, which was maybe 80.1 back in 1932, shifted to nearly 50.50 by 1970. Industrial development, obviously, concentrated in urban areas needing labor, infrastructure, electricity. And the oil enclave itself, the wells, pipelines, refineries, export terminals, became the primary axis connecting Saudi Arabia to the global economy, drawing in labor and stimulating related businesses.
And this had ripple effects even in rural areas that weren't directly involved in oil production.
Yes. Government projects aimed at increasing agricultural harvests, often through providing technology and credit, sometimes had the unintended consequence of displacing traditional rural workers, as imported machinery made their labor redundant. This pushed many to migrate to the rapidly growing cities in search of civil service jobs or other office work generated by government spending.
The source also notes a significant change regarding women's roles during this period.
It does. Traditional agricultural or home-based labor performed by women was increasingly seen as expendable in the new economy, and it was often replaced by the hiring of foreign male workers, especially in agriculture or service roles. Paradoxically, this growing visibility and ubiquity of foreign men in society contributed to increased moral anxiety among conservative segments, leading to greater pressure to enforce stricter norms regarding Saudi women's public presence, keeping them out of sight or more rigorously veiled.
And these rapid social changes, the influx of Western goods and ideas, inevitably led to reactions from the religious clergy, didn't they?
Yes, the influx of Western consumer goods, tastes, and social practices was viewed with considerable apprehension, not just by the clergy, but also by some members of the royal family. The clergy actively pushed for new restrictions to try and contain these changes. The source mentions their successful push to prohibit women from driving in 1957 and efforts to restrict overseas study for Saudis in 1955.
And the religious police became more active.
The religious police, the Mutawin, part of the Committee for Commanding Right and Forbidding Wrong, became more assertive in enforcing public morality, raiding cafes for violations like smoking in Riyadh in 1963 and shutting down cinemas that had started to appear in Jeddah. The introduction of television broadcasting in 1965 provoked significant, sometimes even violent protest from religious conservatives.
That incident in Medina in 1965, the smashing windows one, that really captures the tension vividly, doesn't it?
It does. The source describes a band of religious Puritans in Medina in 1965 who saw Western commercial culture appearing in the shops as a direct threat. They went through the city smashing the windows of stores that displayed female mannequins. This smashing windows incident became a potent symbol of the challenge the religious establishment faced in trying to impose or maintain traditional Wahhabi norms within these rapidly growing urban spaces, increasingly shaped by global consumerism and modern influences.
Education, as we touched on, continued to be a site of conflict and sort of dual development.
While the sheer number of school children grew dramatically, the source mentions going from just 15,000 total in 1950 to much, much larger numbers. Later, there was this ongoing conflict over the fundamental purpose of education.
What was the conflict?
On one side, you had the government and companies like Aramco wanting technically skilled graduates to fuel the modern economy. On the other side, the religious estate saw the expanding education system primarily as a channel for propagating Wahhabi learning and training future religious scholars and functionaries.
And how did that play out?
Although the government largely adopted the structure of the Western educational model in the 1950s, the clerics responded by developing a parallel system of religious institutes starting in the 1960s. These eventually evolved into large, state-funded religious universities in the 1970s and 80s, like the Islamic University of Medina and Imam Mohammed ibn Saud Islamic University in Riyadh. These institutions often adopted a kind of hybrid curriculum, blending some modern science subjects with intensive religious studies, often influenced by the intellectual categories and priorities introduced by those Muslim Brotherhood figures who were teaching there. This effectively created two distinct subcultures within the educated Saudi population, one more secular technocratic, the other deeply embedded in religious scholarship.
There was also resistance within the religious establishment to modernizing legal practices, like codifying Islamic law.
Yes, the idea of formally codifying Sharia law into statutes faced strong opposition from senior figures like the Grand Mufti Mohammed ibn Ibrahim al-Sheikh back in the 1950s. They preferred the traditional system where judges had more interpretive latitude based on established schools of jurisprudence. However, the practical necessities of increased interaction with foreign companies and the need for clearer, predictable legal frameworks, especially in commercial matters, put growing pressure on the system.
So it was a slow process.
Very slow. The source mentions the Board of Senior Clerics even split over the issue in 1973. Codification happened gradually, often sector by sector, and wasn't formally ordered across the board until 2007 by Mohammed ibn Ibrahim's own son, who had become Minister of Justice. It shows a slow but seemingly inevitable shift driven by the practical needs of a modernizing state.
Meanwhile, literary modernism, particularly in the Hijaz, continued to develop looking outward.
Yes, building on those earlier trends we discussed, Hijazi writers continued to look to intellectual centers like Cairo and the Arab diaspora for inspiration and models. Newspapers like The Voice of Hijaz, founded back in 1932 by Muhammad Salih al-Nasif, provided important venues for publishing fiction, poetry, and literary reviews. After World War II, new publications like The Saudi Land emerged, consciously attempting to use literature to project a new sense of shared Saudi national identity.
And what about theater? It was initially controversial, but did it find a foothold eventually?
It often entered society through the side door, mainly via annual school celebrations. Early forms were often didactic skits or plays based on Islamic history. The source notes that even King Abd al-Aziz himself lent prestige to a historical play staged in the town of Unaiza back in 1935. The first fully scripted play mentioned was put on by Egyptian teachers at the Mecca High School in 1937. However, staging plays for a wider public audience outside of these controlled school settings was significantly delayed for decades due to that persistent clerical opposition to public entertainment and depictions of human figures.
It's clear these huge changes were experienced very differently by individuals across society. The source gives some perspectives from novelists.
Yes, it includes perspectives from novelists that offer really interesting glimpses into how these shifts felt on the ground. Ibrahim al-Nasser, born in 1930, is cited for painting a rather grim picture of traditional village life in his story Mischief. He depicts it as dark, stagnant, haunted by belief in spirits and jinn. His protagonist generation explicitly forsook these old superstitions, described as sneering at everything the people of our neighborhood cling to. It shows a real generational break.
And another example.
Fahad al-Klaiwi, born later in 1946, writes in his story The Remains of Memory about a protagonist returning to his village from the city. He reflects on how he had adopted the more relaxed attitudes of urban life compared to what he now saw as the village's unjustifiable constrictions. It captures that tension between urban modernity and rural tradition.
Even traditional Bedouin populations were observing and adapting to these changes, perhaps with mixed feelings.
There's a really poignant observation included from a longtime Western researcher who studied the Rawala Bedouin. She quotes a Rawala woman giving this very mixed assessment of her sons who had gone abroad to study. She says, "It's good that the young men study," but then adds, "We lose them."
Wow.
And she expresses this longing. We wish they didn't live on the other side of the world, yet she concludes with a kind of resignation, saying it isn't the same, but it helps. Accepting that the sense of loss, loneliness, and the devaluation of traditional knowledge is simply a part of modern life. These personal perspectives really highlight the human cost and the complex, often bittersweet nature of such rapid societal transformation.
Okay, let's transition now to the period from the 1970s up to around 2000. This is when external conditions once again swung dramatically in favor of the monarchy, wasn't it?
Yes, the geopolitical landscape shifted significantly in the early 1970s. The defeat of Arab nationalist and leftist movements in what's often called the Arab Cold War reduced the ideological threats the Saudi monarchy had faced from neighbors like Nasser's Egypt. But more significantly, of course, was the sudden massive increase in oil prices following the 1973 oil embargo.
Right, the oil boom.
Exactly. This transformed Saudi Arabia almost overnight into a major global economic and political player, giving the state unprecedented financial power and influence.
And this is where that concept of the rentier state becomes particularly applicable, doesn't it?
Yes, the source explicitly introduces the rentier-state model here. It's a situation where the welfare and livelihood of the population become heavily dependent on the state's ability to capture and then invest and allocate income derived primarily from external sources, in this case, oil rents, rather than from taxing its own citizens' productive activities.
And how did the state deploy this massive new wealth initially?
The initial focus of this wealth redistribution and national development was captured in the first two five-year plans, covering 1970-75 and 1975-80. These prioritized huge investments in physical infrastructure, building modern transportation and communication networks across the vast country, expanding access to education at all levels, and developing a domestic petrochemical industry to add value to the oil. The second plan specifically aimed to address the growing urban housing shortages and transport capacity issues that arose from the boom itself.
And this rentier model, it profoundly shaped the employment landscape for decades.
Absolutely. The model led directly to a situation where most Saudi citizens sought, and usually obtained, jobs in the rapidly expanding public sector government ministries, state-owned enterprises. The private sector, meanwhile, became heavily dependent on two things: government contracts fueled by oil spending, and a massive imported expatriate workforce to do much of the manual and technical labor.
Does the source critique this model at all?
It acknowledges critiques, yes. Some argue the rentier-state model can underplay the constraints imposed by volatile international oil markets, or perhaps overestimate the state's autonomy from social demands and pressures, because cutting services or salaries in a rentier system can be highly destabilizing politically. However, the source concludes the model is valuable for highlighting the fundamental similarities between countries where state control over massive external revenue gives it extraordinary power to direct resources, drive processes like urbanization, and maintain political dominance through a combination of distributing rewards and selectively applying repression.
And the pace of social change during the 1970s, that first decade of truly high oil revenues, must have accelerated dramatically.
Incredibly so. By 1990, the country was overwhelmingly urbanized. The source estimates around 70% of Saudis lived in cities, with roughly a third concentrated in major urban centers with populations over 100,000 like Riyadh, Jeddah, and Dammam. But smaller towns also grew, benefiting from the expansion of government services into rural areas.
And we saw improvements in social indicators.
Yes, significant improvements in health and education outcomes, lower infant mortality rates, extended life expectancy, many more trained teachers, dramatic increases in school enrollment at all levels. Though the source does consistently note a persistent gender gap, particularly in access to higher education and certain fields of study.
And state institutions, state influence, reached even further into traditionally more independent parts of the country.
Yes, the example given is the Sajir Brethren colony, which was originally one of those Ikhwan settlements established for formerly nomadic Bedouin back in the 1920s. By the 1970s and 80s, state inputs like interest-free agricultural loans and subsidies, combined with new roads built with oil money, stimulated commercial cultivation there, often carried out by hired foreign workers, fully integrating these historically semi-autonomous areas into the national economy and under firmer state control.
How did ordinary Saudis react to these incredibly accelerated changes? Were they welcomed? Resisted?
It was complex, obviously. Many were clearly eager to leave behind the austerity and hardship of the pre-oil era. The source mentions that modernist Saudi authors writing during this period generally didn't romanticize the old life, which they often depicted as marked by chronic illness, poverty, and superstition.
And the impact on women's visibility.
The significant rise in girls' education enrollment, the numbers jumped dramatically again. Elementary enrollment going from 45,000 in 1965 to 325,000 by 1980. Intermediate from 1,000 to 80,000, this undeniably raised women's public profile. By the mid-1970s, the source notes, women were managing charitable organizations, appearing, albeit usually veiled, on television news programs, and beginning to work in professions like medicine and journalism, mostly in segregated environments.
But these changes, especially concerning women, prompted a strong reaction from the religious establishment, didn't they? They were seen as potentially disruptive to the social order.
Absolutely. The religious establishment responded proactively by developing new rules and social norms aimed at containing these changes and preserving gender segregation. This included pushing for strictly segregated workplaces where women did enter the workforce, and rules requiring the blurring or removal of images of women in advertising and media.
And this period also saw the rise of a new kind of religious activism, the awakening, or Sawa.
Yes, the source introduces the Sawa here. It's described as an activist religious current that gained significant momentum during the 1970s and 80s. Its rise was facilitated, somewhat ironically, partly by Riyadh's own foreign policy during the Arab Cold War.
Also,
Well, in its search for allies against secular Arab nationalist regimes and meeting personnel for its expanding transnational Islamic organizations and the rapidly growing university system, the Saudi state welcomed Islamists from other Arab countries.
and this is where figures associated with the Muslim Brotherhood became particularly influential within Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. Members of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, who were often persecuted in more secular states like Egypt or Syria, found employment opportunities and a generally hospitable religious and cultural environment in Saudi Arabia. They were seen by the Saudi monarchy at the time as dependable allies against secular ideologies and radical leftist movements.
But there was a fundamental contradiction there, wasn't there? Between the Brotherhood's ideology and Saudi foreign policy.
Yes. The source highlights this crucial contradiction. While the Brotherhood members were useful allies domestically and in the education system, their fervent anti-imperialist agenda, particularly their opposition to the West and Israel, was fundamentally at odds with Riyadh's increasingly close strategic and economic ties with the United States and other Western powers.
So a ticking time bomb almost.
This tension remained largely latent, simmering beneath the surface, until the 1990 Kuwait crisis brought it dramatically into the open. The source views the influence of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, alongside secular modernists, as powerful external forces that gradually began to dissolve the more traditional insular Wahhabi ramparts, fostering a more politicized religious identity, especially among the graduates pouring out of those expanding religious universities.
This period of rapid transformation, economic boom, and these simmering ideological tensions all culminated dramatically in the intertwined crises of 1979. The source argues these reflected the integration of both national and transnational dynamics.
Yes, 1979 was a pivotal year. First, you had the Iranian Revolution in February. This had a significant galvanizing impact, inspiring many among Saudi Arabia's own Shiite population, a community that the source notes had only relatively recently been officially recognized and framed by the state as a distinct Saudi Shiite minority. They began to mobilize more actively under the banner of transnational Shiite political movements that had been developing since the 1960s.
And then came the truly extraordinary event later that year, the Mecca Uprising.
Exactly. In November 1979, this was led by a figure named Juhayman al-Utaibi and his followers, known as the Salafi group, Al-Jama'a al-Salafiyya al-Mutasiba. This group had actually split from the mainstream religious establishment a couple of years earlier after a meeting with the deputy of the Grand Mufti, Ibn Baz, in 1977. Ibn Baz's deputy had tried, unsuccessfully, to persuade them to moderate their radical views and conform.
And what were their views? What did they do?
Juhayman traveled across the country rallying followers, denouncing the Saudi government for corruption, for its ties with the West, and for what he saw as deviations from true Islam. He urged his followers to quit government jobs, boycott state schools, and reject the authority of the official clerics. Then, on November 20th, 1979, the first day of the new Islamic century, his heavily armed group seized control of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, the holiest site in Islam, taking thousands of worshippers hostage. They proclaimed that the Mahdi, the messianic figure expected by some Muslims, had appeared among them in the form of one of Juhayman's relatives.
How does the source interpret this shocking event?
Commins interprets it as reflecting both the national integration or perhaps maladjustment of demobilized Bedouin populations. Juhayman himself was from a Bedouin background associated with the old Ikhwan, and the transnational integration of religious institutions and ideas. Many of Juhayman's followers had been exposed to broader, more radical Salafi currents at places like the Islamic University of Medina, which had become a hub for students from across the Muslim world, bringing diverse interpretations of Islam.
And concurrently, just days later, major protests erupted in the eastern province, where most of Saudi Arabia's Shiite population lives.
That's right. Activists associated with the Iraqi cleric Ayatollah Shirazi, who had formed an underground group called the Organization of Islamic Revolution, had been preparing to defy the long-standing government ban on public processions marking Ashura, a key Shiite commemoration.
And it turned violent.
Yes. A procession held on November 26th escalated into violent confrontations with the National Guard on November 28th. Leaflets distributed by the activists attacked both Western imperialism and royal corruption, criticized lavish military spending, and called for a constitution. Interestingly, the source notes that some leftist groups also joined the unrest. holding separate protests focused on issues like the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, sectarian discrimination, and local grievances concerning poor health and sanitation services in predominantly Shiite areas like Qatif.
How did the state respond?
It took security forces about 5 days to fully suppress the unrest. Over 20 people were killed, and many leaders fled into exile. However, the source does mention that the government later responded by addressing some of the specific local grievances about services that had been raised, implicitly acknowledging a link between local socioeconomic issues and the broader political and sectarian mobilization.
Okay, moving into the 1990s. The Kuwait crisis, triggered by Iraq's invasion in August 1990, marked another major turning point, particularly in exposing some of those internal divisions we talked about.
Absolutely. The crisis, which lasted from August 1990 to February 1991, forced Saudi Arabia into a very difficult position. King Fahd's ultimate decision to invite hundreds of thousands of U.S. and coalition forces onto Saudi soil to liberate Kuwait triggered significant vocal dissent from within the kingdom, particularly from that awakening Sawa movement.
Why? What was their objection?
They viewed this massive deployment of non-Muslim infidel American forces on the sacred soil of Arabia as a profound betrayal of Islamic principles and a clear violation of the kingdom's stated identity as the guardian of Islam's holy places. It brought that latent contradiction between religious legitimacy and Western alliance right to the forefront.
And this dissent wasn't just quiet grumbling, it took a more organized public form, didn't it?
It did. In 1991, prominent figures associated with the awakening presented a formal petition directly to King Fahd. It became known as the Memorandum of Advice, Mudhakirat al-Nasiha. It called for significant institutional reforms, arguing that the monarchy needed to bolster its religious legitimacy by adhering more strictly to Islamic law, empowering the ulema, religious scholars, establishing a truly consultative council based on Islamic principles, and curbing corruption and Western influence.
How did the government respond to this direct challenge?
It was a mixed response. On one hand, a limited political opening was offered. The Basic Law of Governance was issued in 1992, and the appointed Consultative Council, Majlis al-Shura, was finally established in 1993, along with provincial councils. But on the other hand, there was also a clear crackdown on the more vocal critics. Leading Sawa figures were arrested or dismissed from their positions, and the state increased efforts to control the media and public religious discourse.
And this crisis is also where Osama bin Laden enters the narrative in a much more prominent way, framing the situation through his own radical global lens.
Yes. Bin Laden, himself a Saudi from a wealthy, well-connected family, viewed King Fahd's decision to allow American troops in as a catastrophic betrayal of the entire Muslim world. The source notes he explicitly drew a parallel between this act and King Abdulaziz's earlier pragmatic support for the British presence in Palestine, seeing both as unforgivable alliances with infidel powers acting against Muslim interests.
And this solidified his path towards global jihad.
It seems so. For bin Laden, this act confirmed his view of the Saudi regime itself as illegitimate and deeply compromised. It reinforced his belief in the necessity of a global jihad to defend Islam against perceived unbelief and pervasive Western influence. However, the source makes an important point. Despite bin Laden's Saudi origins and the significant involvement of Saudi nationals in al-Qaeda attacks later on, the group itself didn't gain a massive popular following within Saudi Arabia during the 1990s.
Why not?
Partly, the source suggests, because Saudi security forces were relatively successful at exposing and disrupting several al-Qaeda plots inside the kingdom in 1998 and 1999. This apparent lack of operational success within Saudi Arabia led bin Laden to shift his focus for activities within the kingdom primarily towards fundraising and recruiting individuals to fight elsewhere, rather than attempting large-scale attacks domestically at that stage.
Technology also continued to shape Saudi society in the 1990s, sometimes in ways that created new challenges or highlighted existing problems.
Yes. The source notes a persistent mismatch, which became more apparent, between the types of degrees Saudi universities were producing, often in religious studies or humanities, and the actual needs of the modernizing workforce, which required more technical and vocational skills. Hassan al-Nemi's short story, Rowan and the Newspaper Vendor, is cited again as an example, sketching the misery and frustration of a history graduate struggling to find suitable employment and the resulting strain on his family. It illustrated a real systemic problem of graduate underemployment.
And mobility and urbanization continued.
Relentlessly. As we noted, about 70% of Saudis were living in cities by the early 90s. Increased mobility was facilitated by widespread car ownership among the middle class and the availability of domestic air travel, connecting the vast country more effectively.
And the arrival of new media technologies during this decade had a huge impact on information flow and the state's ability to control it, didn't it?
A massive impact. The spread of satellite television, especially with the launch of the relatively independent Arabic news channel Al Jazeera from neighboring Qatar in 1996, and then the introduction of the internet initially with limited research access from 1993, then broader public access from 1999. These technologies effectively blew holes through the state's traditional censorship mechanism.
Yeah, so.
They dramatically broadened the range of voices and perspectives Saudis could access, and the audiences they could potentially reach, both inside and outside the country. While the government certainly attempted to block politically sensitive or religiously controversial websites, Saudis quickly found ways around the censorship, especially when it came to accessing entertainment content, foreign news, or social platforms. For many, accessing this forbidden content became a form of quiet, everyday transgression against strict social norms, even if they weren't overtly politically active. It created new spaces for communication and exposure to outside ideas.
Okay, let's move into the post-9/11 era, roughly from 2001 to 2015. This period saw the regional landscape become increasingly unstable, and the implications of Saudi Arabia's external relationships, particularly with the U.S., became starkly apparent.
Yes, the September 11th attacks in 2001, carried out primarily by Saudi nationals affiliated with al-Qaeda, fundamentally reshaped the global context and put the Saudi-U.S. relationship under intense strain. It threw that inherent contradiction Riyadh faced into sharp relief.
The contradiction being,
how could the kingdom maintain its close strategic ties with Washington, its primary security guarantor, while also upholding a domestic and international legitimacy rooted in its role as the guardian of Islam and supporter of Muslim causes worldwide, which often required distance from the U.S., seen as Israel's main patron? Post 9/11, the pressure intensified. If Riyadh was truly devoted to Muslim causes, it needed to distance itself from the U.S. If it wanted to remain a reliable U.S. partner, it had to decisively curb or end support for the transnational Wahhabi institutions and interpretations that were seen, rightly or wrongly, as having contributed to the rise of extremist ideology like al-Qaeda's.
How did the Saudi government under King Fahd initially and then King Abdullah after 2005 respond to this immense pressure?
Crown Prince Abdullah, who effectively ran day-to-day affairs during King Fahd's later illness and then became king himself in 2005, generally favored a cautious, incremental approach to reform. He seemed to lean towards curbing the influence of the more hardline elements of the Wahhabi mission, partly by promoting public dialogue about the need for change and moderation. But his actions were often slow and carefully calibrated, which frustrated many Saudis liberals, women activists, Shiites who desired faster progress on political reform, women's rights, and addressing sectarian discrimination. Abdullah's succession in 2005 essentially reaffirmed this policy of prioritizing stability while pursuing limited incremental opening and reform.
And the Western demands for reform after 9/11, focusing on issues like democracy and human rights, seemed to align, at least superficially, with the aims of Saudi Arabia's own liberal camp.
They did, to some extent. In January 2003, just as the U.S. was preparing to invade Iraq, a significant petition was submitted directly to Crown Prince Abdullah. It was signed by over 100 prominent Saudi writers, academics, and businessmen. Titled A Vision for the Present and Future of the Homeland, it called for quite extensive political reform.
What specifically did they ask for?
They cleverly framed their demands using the traditional Islamic principle of consultation, shura, arguing it was the essential foundation for securing national welfare. They demanded things like a fully elected consultative council, not just appointed, the establishment of an independent body to protect human rights, and guarantees for freedom of speech and association.
But Abdullah's response wasn't exactly to embrace Western-style liberal democracy, was it?
No, while he publicly agreed that change was necessary and acknowledged the petition, he did not accept the core demands for institutional limits on royal power or the immediate implementation of liberal rights as defined by the petitioners. His administration tended to view religious intolerance and extremism as the primary root cause of the kingdom's problems, rather than the lack of political participation.
So what was his main initiative in response?
His key initiative was launching the national dialogue process. It began with a major event in June 2003 explicitly titled Reinforcing National Unity. Significantly, this brought together Saudis from different religious backgrounds, including mainstream Wahhabis, moderate Islamists, Sufis, and importantly, representatives from the Twelver Shiite minority. This was seen as a significant, albeit largely symbolic step. a public recognition by the state of the kingdom's internal religious and regional pluralism, and an acknowledgement of the need for social reconciliation, even if the concrete political reforms remained limited.
But despite these efforts at dialogue and incremental reform, religious activism, particularly of a militant kind, continued to pose a serious threat, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely. From 2003 to around 2007, Saudi Arabia faced a significant wave of deadly terrorist attacks carried out by al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP. The source explains that AQAP was able to recruit effectively from pre-existing militant networks within the kingdom, often led by dissident clerics who rejected the authority of the state and the official religious establishment, alongside veterans returning from the Afghan jihad against the Soviets and later conflicts.
And these clerics openly supported al-Qaeda.
Some did. The source mentions dissident clerics issuing online statements supporting the 9/11 attacks, which marked a clear break not only from the official establishment ulema, but also from many of the mainstream awakening sheikhs who had publicly denounced the attacks on the U.S. networks, like the one led by Yusuf al-Wiyari, before he was killed by security forces, proved adept at using the internet operating websites like Al-Neda, as well as utilizing remote desert farms for training and maintaining a network of safe houses across multiple cities. It was a serious internal security challenge. Now, alongside these security challenges, that national dialogue initiative, even if its political impact was limited, did seem to contribute to a sense of, well, cautious social and cultural opening in the early 2000s.
How so?
The source suggests that journalists, academics, and writers felt somewhat encouraged or perhaps less constrained in articulating visions of a more open, tolerant society, even within existing red lines.
And technology continued to play a role in accelerating this.
Definitely. The rapid, continued spread of satellite TV, the increasing penetration of the internet, and the burgeoning use of social media platforms vastly expanded the communication networks available to ordinary Saudis. This broadened the range of voices they could access, both domestic and international, and the audiences they could potentially participate in. Satellite TV in particular played an interesting role in disseminating what the source describes as more moderate religious interpretations, often through popular Egyptian televangelists who emphasized personal piety and coexistence while still upholding generally conservative social and moral values. It offered alternatives to both the official Wahhabi line and the more radical Salafi jihadi discourse.
The economic challenges, particularly the issues of poverty and the reliance on foreign workers, also persisted during this period under King Abdullah, didn't they?
Yes. Domestic welfare associations became more vocal and visible in highlighting the extent of poverty that existed within the kingdom, despite the immense oil wealth. This prompted Crown Prince Abdallah, even before he became king, to make a high-profile visit to poor neighborhoods in Riyadh in November 2002 and subsequently launch a national campaign aimed at eradicating poverty.
What did that involve?
The resulting national strategy to eradicate poverty seemed to assume that unemployment among Saudis was the primary root cause. It proposed both short-term measures, like increased financial benefits and charity, and longer-term plans centered on improving education and vocational training to facilitate Saudization, the policy aim of replacing foreign workers with Saudi nationals in the workforce. However, the source notes a distinct lack of public data released on the strategy's actual success, citing one independent estimate from 2010 that suggested poverty levels might still be hovering around 30% of the Saudi population.
And that long-standing, complex issue of reliance on foreign workers continued to be a major factor.
A huge factor. The source points out the specific terminology often used in official discourse. Foreign workers, rather than immigrants or migrant workers, reflects a kind of societal or official immigration denial, a reluctance to acknowledge the long-term presence and potential settlement of these millions of workers. And conditions for some, particularly Asian women employed as domestic workers, often remained extremely harsh.
Can you give a specific example?
The source provides a specific example from the early 2000s concerning Sri Lankan domestic workers. They typically earned only $100 to $140 per month, which, while significantly more than they could earn back home, was only about a fifth of the official Saudi minimum wage at the time. And they often faced grueling conditions, including 16 to 20-hour workdays with little time off, and vulnerability to abuse due to the sponsorship system tying them to their employers.
Shiite unrest, which we saw surface back in 1979, also reemerged as a significant issue during this period, didn't it?
Yes, there was a renewed government confrontation with segments of the Shiite community. A key flashpoint occurred in Medina in February 2009. Clashes erupted between security forces and Shiite pilgrims near the Prophet's mosque during a celebration of the Prophet's birthday, a practice considered an unacceptable innovation, bid'ah, by strict Wahhabis. The trigger was apparently Shiite pilgrims suspecting that members of the religious police were covertly filming women in their group.
And this escalated.
It led to 5 days of clashes in Medina, resulting in dozens of arrests. And this incident, in turn, quickly triggered solidarity protests back in the predominantly Shiite eastern province.
And this is where the prominent Shiite cleric Nimr al-Nimr came to the forefront.
Exactly. In mid-March 2009, in response to the Medina events and ongoing grievances in the east, Nimr al-Nimr delivered a fiery sermon that became known as his dignity speech. It was recorded and spread widely via the internet. In it, he directly challenged Saudi rule over the eastern province and called on the Shiite community, in quite provocative terms, to be prepared to throw off the monarchy's authority if necessary.
And the state reacted strongly.
Yes, his arrest shortly afterwards, and a subsequent security crackdown, including a curfew in his hometown of Awamiya, set off a cycle of contestation protests, arrests, further protests that simmered, and then gained significant further momentum during the wider regional Arab uprisings that began in late 2010 and swept through 2011. Nimr al-Nimr became a key symbol of Shiite opposition.
Regional proxy conflicts also became more visible and increasingly intertwined with Saudi Arabia's internal dynamics and security concerns during this period, particularly regarding Yemen on its southern border.
Yes, the source links back to the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Yemeni workers during the 1990-91 Kuwait crisis. This had severe negative consequences for the economy of northern Yemen and contributed to a rise in cross-border smuggling activity. Then the struggle against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, in the early 2000s drew intense security attention to the porous Yemen border, seeing it as a key conduit for smuggling weapons and facilitating militant infiltration into the kingdom. This led to increased Saudi efforts at border security fortification.
And there was also a religious dimension to Saudi involvement in Yemen.
Yes, the source highlights Saudi religious proselytizing efforts, promoting Salafi interpretations of Islam within the traditionally Zaidi Shiite region of Sada in northern Yemen, particularly during the 1980s and 90s. This was often facilitated by Yemeni students who had studied at Saudi religious institutions like the Islamic University of Medina and returned home as committed Salafists, setting up their own religious centers with Saudi funding.
And this context is important for understanding the rise of the Houthi movement.
Seems so. Local Zaidis in Sada often blame the Yemeni central government under President Ali Abdullah Saleh for failing to block this perceived Saudi religious encroachment and influence. Figures like Badr al-Din al-Houthi and his son Hussein emerged as leaders of a Zaidi religious revival movement, founding the Association of Believing Youth, which eventually became known simply as the Houthis.
How are they viewed by the Yemeni government and by Saudi Arabia?
The Yemeni national government often viewed the Houthis as destabilizing, sometimes accusing them of seeking to restore the old Zaidi image that ruled North Yemen before 1962 or later of being proxies for Iran. The Houthis, in turn, accused the Yemeni government of persecuting Zaidis, partly on behalf of its Saudi sponsors. This created a complex local dynamic deeply entangled with regional rivalries and Saudi security concerns about its southern border.
Okay, finally, let's look at the most recent period of transformations, really kicking off from 2015 to the present day.
Yes, under King Salman, who came to the throne in 2015, and particularly under the influence and direction of his son, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, who was named Crown Prince in 2017, there has been a really concerted, rapid, and top-down push to assert the monarchy's direct authority over the religious establishment and implement sweeping changes in public social life.
And these changes have been quite dramatic and highly visible, haven't they? Things people thought might never happen.
Absolutely. They include lifting major, long-standing social bans, most famously, allowing women to drive, but also permitting public mingling of unrelated men and women in many contexts, opening the country to public entertainment like concerts and cinemas, and actively promoting creative arts. This necessarily required significantly curtailing the power and public presence of the religious police patrols, who had for decades been the enforcers of strict Wahhabi social norms on the streets.
And a new narrative, a new justification has been developed to legitimize these potentially controversial changes.
Yes, the source describes this new official narrative as claiming that the country's original, supposedly moderate religious heritage is actually fully compatible with a more liberal social environment. This narrative asserts that extremist ideologies, particularly those linked to the Muslim Brotherhood and the radicalism that fueled the 1979 Mecca uprising, were essentially foreign infiltrations, not indigenous to Saudi society.
So the claim is that MBS is restoring an older, purer, more tolerant Saudi tradition.
That's the essence of the claim, yes. That King Salman and MBS are aiming to restore this putative, moderate way of life that was supposedly derailed by extremism in recent decades.
And the religious establishment itself seems to be undergoing a significant restructuring to align with, or at least not obstruct, this new direction.
It certainly appears so. The Committee for Commanding Right and Forbidding Wrong, the formal body overseeing the religious police, has been significantly weakened, its powers curtailed, and its mission redirected towards emphasizing obedience to the ruler and promoting national unity, rather than actively policing public morality in the old way.
And appointments to key religious posts reflect this shift.
Yes. Clerics perceived as being willing to publicly advocate for more moderate interpretations, or at least willing to toe the government line, have been appointed to lead key religious agencies. The source mentions Mohammed al-Isa heading the Muslim World League and also being influential on the board of senior clerics, a body which has publicly endorsed controversial changes like allowing women to drive and formally condemned the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. Similarly, a pragmatic member of the al-Sheikh family was appointed to lead the powerful Ministry of Islamic Affairs, tasked with overseeing mosque personnel, reining in potential critics among preachers, and ensuring sermons emphasize obedience to authority and preach against terrorism. Clerics who are clearly unhappy with these rapid changes have largely been forced into silence or have gone into exile.
And all of this social liberalization runs alongside the ambitious economic and social transformation plan, Vision 2030.
Exactly. The source frames Vision 2030 as the new overarching formula intended to legitimize dynastic power in the 21st century. It's a grand project that celebrates youth, technology, and creativity. It promises a future defined by economic prosperity through diversification away from oil, an advanced, efficient state, status as a major regional power, and a society open to arts, culture, and entertainment, positioning Saudi Arabia as being on par with other G20 nations.
It sounds like a fundamental shift in how the state aims to define itself and its relationship with its people, moving away from the old model.
The ambition articulated in Vision 2030 is for Saudi Arabia to become the author of its own destiny, less reliant on volatile oil markets. It envisions developing a more efficient state apparatus, but also one that steps back from being the dominant investor and primary employer. It aims, at least rhetorically, to finally end the deep dependence on foreign workers, and also marks a significant retreat from the previous emphasis on transnational religious solidarity that characterized earlier periods of Saudi foreign policy.
And the source offers a conclusion on this shift.
Yes, Commins concludes, based on the source material, that in what can be seen as Saudi Arabia's long internal culture war, a struggle dating back to the annexation of the Hijaz and the recurring conflicts over modernity versus tradition, the modernists have, for the time being at least, clearly prevailed under MBS.
And what's the potential implication, or perhaps the calculated trade-off, of this rapid top-down social opening?
The source suggests one possible implication of Vision 2030 is that citizens who are genuinely grateful for the relief from the very real restrictions and suffocating puritanical social controls of the past might, therefore, be more willing to overlook or accept continued state surveillance, the social and economic disruption caused by the rapid changes, and the ongoing repression of any calls for independent political rights or genuine government accountability that go beyond the state-directed reforms.
Saudi Arabia's global engagement is also being redefined in this new era, isn't it? Especially in areas like foreign aid.
Yes. Following the intense international scrutiny and suspicion after 9/11 regarding Saudi Arabia's past failures to adequately regulate charitable organizations, some of which were accused of funding extremism, King Salman took decisive steps after 2015 to centralize and gain full state control over external charity. He established KS Relief, the King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center.
And how is this different from before?
It marked a significant departure from the previous approach, which often involved multiple semi-autonomous agencies and frequently framed aid in explicitly religious terms like dawah or Islamic call. Chaos Relief, by contrast, explicitly asserts state authority, adopts the secular language and operational norms of international humanitarian aid organizations like those in Europe and North America, and deliberately highlights cooperation with bodies like the UN and Western aid agencies rather than focusing primarily on Islamic institutions. It's a shift towards projecting a more conventional state image internationally.
And there have been shifts in geopolitical alignments, too.
Yes, diplomacy remains fluid. The source was likely finalized before some very recent shifts, but it does allude to the changing regional landscape, which has since seen developments like the Saudi restoration of diplomatic ties with Iran in March 2023, brokered by China, another sign of shifting global dynamics.
And the source even offers a brief forecast for the relationship with the U.S., specifically looking ahead to a potential second Trump term starting in 2025.
It does. Based on the trends observed, it suggests that the core of the U.S.-Saudi relationship under such a scenario would likely remain focused on transactional interests. Strategic security guarantees and arms sales for Riyadh, and energy market stability and counterterrorism cooperation for Washington.
But despite all these sweeping changes under Vision 2030 and the shifting external relationships, the source identifies ongoing, fundamental challenges that could still threaten the monarchy's long-term position.
Yes, underlying structural issues remain. The inherent volatility of global oil prices, and, perhaps more significantly, the longer-term prospect of falling global demand for fossil fuels due to climate change policies and the energy transition, remain significant threats to the kingdom's primary and still dominant source of revenue. Additionally, the continued strain placed on the state budget by the political necessity of providing mass public sector employment to its large youth population remains a major economic and social challenge. Failure to manage these could potentially erode the monarchy's stability and the social contract underpinning its rule.
Wow. That was a truly deep dive. We've covered centuries of history, really showing how Saudi Arabia has constantly adapted and transformed, often in deeply contradictory ways, but consistently leveraging resources, symbolic, fiscal, military, political, from the outside world.
We really have. We've seen the state evolve from its very specific origins built on a particular religious mission and the somewhat harsh fiscal resource of plunder through periods of collapse and revival fueled by new external patrons and competing ideologies, to a modern state grappling with the immense impact of oil wealth, globalization, internal dissent, and now attempting this incredibly rapid social and economic reorientation under Vision 2030.
And David Commins' core idea, that argument presented in the source about Saudi rulers consistently leveraging external resources, it really does provide a coherent thread through this long and incredibly complex narrative, doesn't it? It shows how each solution, each new resource tapped, inevitably seemed to create new internal dynamics, new challenges, new contradictions that then had to be managed.
It's clearly a history of constant adaptation, yes, but also one defined by that inherent, enduring tension. The tension between the foundational desire for or claim to purity and traditional authority on one hand, and the undeniable, often disruptive pressures and opportunities presented by engagement with the wider, globalized world on the other. The current era under Vision 2030 feels like the latest and perhaps the most dramatic and high-stakes phase of this ongoing process.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with this provocative question to think about. As Saudi Arabia seems to be accelerating its integration into the global social, cultural, and economic sphere, and perhaps consciously stepping back from that traditional religious pillar of its legitimacy that defined it for so long, how will it ultimately define and maintain its identity and its authority in the 21st century? What new external resources, maybe technological, maybe financial, maybe geopolitical, will it seek to leverage now? And crucially, what new, perhaps completely unexpected internal dynamics and challenges will this unleashed transformation create within the kingdom itself? It's a story that is clearly, powerfully still unfolding.
Absolutely. This deep dive, based on the Commins excerpts, offers one valuable framework for understanding that ongoing story, but it's definitely just the beginning. We strongly encourage you to explore the topic further, perhaps starting with the source material we discussed today.